The first time Ida Whitfield ever laid eyes on Peter Prescott. He was standing in the open doors of his smithy with his back to her, hammering a glowing iron bar into the shape of a wagon rim, and she called out to him 3 times before she understood that no matter how loud she shouted, the man would never turn around. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Cedar Hollow, Wyoming Territory, was still little more than a scattering of clapboard buildings pressed against the base of the Laramie foothills, held together by a dusty main street, a mercantile, a church with a bell that rarely rang, and a blacksmith shop that everyone in 3 counties depended upon whether they liked its owner or not. Ida had arrived 2 weeks earlier on the stagecoach from Cheyenne, a black mourning ribbon still pinned to her sleeve for a father buried less than a month, carrying with her a trunk of clothes, a deed to 400 acres of grazing land, and precious little else in the way of comfort. She had not wanted to come to Wyoming. She had wanted, more than anything, to stay in Ohio where her mother's grave was, and where the roads were paved with something other than dust and regret. But her father's letters in his final years had spoken so often of the ranch he was building, the cattle he meant to raise, the life he wanted to give her once she came west, that when the telegram arrived saying he had died of a fall from his horse, she had felt she owed it to him to see the place at least once before she decided whether to sell it. Now standing in the yard outside the blacksmith shop with her mare's front shoe half torn away and blood on the animal's fetlock from where she had stumbled on a rock, Ida discovered that Cedar Hollow's only smith was a man who could not hear her, and for a moment she stood there feeling foolish and afraid, calling his name into wind that carried her words nowhere. "Mr. Prescott," she called again, raising her voice until it cracked. "Mr. Prescott, please, my horse is hurt." The man at the anvil did not so much as flinch. He kept striking the iron with even, practiced blows, the muscles of his forearms bunching beneath rolled sleeves, sweat darkening the back of his shirt despite the cool morning. Ida looked around the yard for someone else, anyone else, who might carry a message to him, but the yard was empty save for a dog asleep in the shade and a rooster picking through the dirt near the fence. She might have turned around and walked her limping horse the 2 miles back to the ranch, rather than trouble a man who would not answer her, but the animal's distress decided the matter. She crossed the yard, careful of a pile of scrap iron and a barrel of quenching water, and came to stand almost directly beside him, close enough that when she spoke his name a 4th time, softer now, almost a whisper, he lowered the hammer at last and turned. His eyes found her face before his body had even fully turned to meet her, and something in the way he looked at her, not startled, not annoyed, but simply attentive, told her before he ever spoke a word that this man watched people differently than other men did. "Forgive me," he said, and his voice carried the particular flatness of a man who had not heard his own speech in many years, careful and deliberate, each word placed like a stone set into mortar. "I did not know you were there. I do not hear." Ida blinked. "You do not hear at all. Not since I was 10 years old," he said. "Scarlet fever took it from me. I read your lips just now when you came close enough. From across the yard, I only know a man is shouting because I feel it in my boots, through the ground, if the hammer is not too loud." He looked past her to the mare, taking in the injured leg with a single practiced glance, and any awkwardness in his face gave way at once to the plain competence of a man assessing a task. "Your horse has torn her shoe on stone. Bring her to the trough there out of the sun, and I will look at the leg." It was, Ida would think many times in the months to come, the strangest and most ordinary conversation of her life. Ordinary because he spoke of horseshoes and shade with no more drama than any smith might, and strange because she had never in her 22 years met a man who watched her mouth the way other men watched a woman's eyes, as though her words were something precious he did not intend to miss. He was, she judged, perhaps 28 years old, tall and broad through the shoulders in the manner of men who had spent their lives at the forge, with dark hair that wanted cutting and a face weathered by sun and work rather than years. a face that might have been called handsome if it were not so often set in the careful, watchful stillness of a man accustomed to studying the world through his eyes alone. When he knelt beside her mare and ran his hands along the injured leg, his touch was unhurried and sure, and the horse, which had been skittish with Ida all morning, quieted almost at once beneath his hands. "It is not broken," he said, glancing up at her, and she noticed again how he positioned himself so that the light fell upon her face when he expected her to answer. "A stone bruise and the shoe torn loose at the nail. I can reshoe her within the hour if you can wait." "I can wait," Ida said, and because she did not know yet that it mattered, she said it while looking down at her hands rather than at him, and he tilted his head, waiting, until she looked up again and repeated herself, and only then did he nod and rise to fetch his tools. She sat on an overturned crate near the shop's open door and watched him work, and it did not take her long to understand the rhythm of the yard, that Peter Prescott moved through his trade guided by sight and touch, and the vibrations that came up through the earth into the soles of his boots, that he checked over his shoulder more often than other men might, not from nervousness but from long habit. The habit of a man who could be surprised by nothing that approached him from behind unless he made a point of watching for it. "You must forgive my staring," she said when he glanced her way again, feeling suddenly that she owed him an explanation for the way she had been studying him. "I have never known anyone who could not hear. Most people in this town have known me all their lives and still speak as though I am not in the room," Peter said, without bitterness, simply as a fact laid upon the anvil between them. "They forget, or they never learn, that I can understand them if they will only look at me when they speak. It is easier for them to write me off as slow or as a curiosity than to trouble themselves to be seen." "That seems a great unkindness," Ida said. "It is the way of things," he said, and shrugged, though something in his eyes suggested the shrug cost him more than he let show. "I have my trade. I have this shop, which was my father's, and before that my grandfather's. I do not need every soul in Cedar Hollow to speak kindly to me. I need only enough business to keep the forge burning." Ida found, in the weeks that followed, that she thought of him more often than she expected to, of the careful way he had knelt beside her horse, of his voice with its strange flat cadence, of the intensity of his attention when she spoke, as though nothing else in the world existed in that moment but her words upon her lips. She told herself this was merely gratitude, for he had fixed her horse's shoe and refused to take more than the fair price for it. And she told herself that a woman recently widowed of her only remaining parent, alone in a strange territory, had no business thinking of any man at all, blacksmith or otherwise. But the ranch her father had left her was a hard, lonely place, 400 acres of grass and creek bottom with a house not yet finished and fences not yet mended. And within a fortnight of her arrival she had cause to visit the smithy again, this time to have a broken plow blade repaired, and again a week after that for a set of hinges for the barn door, and if she found herself lingering longer than the work strictly required. Watching Peter Prescott's hands at the forge and the play of firelight across his face, she told herself it was only because Cedar Hollow offered so little else in the way of company for a woman still learning the shape of her new life. It was on her third visit, in the late afternoon with the sun slanting long and gold across the yard, that she first understood the truth of the title the town would one day give him, though of course no one called him that yet, and it would be years before anyone thought to speak of it as a story at all. She had come to fetch the mended hinges, and finding him occupied at the far end of the yard, bent over a wagon axle with his back to the gate, she had called out his name in greeting the way she had learned to do with anyone else in town, not yet remembering that with Peter such a greeting would fall upon silence. But he turned. He turned before she had even finished the second syllable of his name, turned as though he had heard her plainly, and for a startled instant Ida thought perhaps his hearing had returned, some miracle of the mountain air restoring what fever had stolen so many years before. It was only when she came closer, laughing a little at her own foolish hope, that she understood the truth of it. "I saw your mouth moving from the corner of my eye," Peter explained, setting down his tools and wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. "I have learned to watch for the shape of my own name upon a stranger's lips, even from a distance, even without turning my head fully toward them. It has saved me a good deal of trouble over the years, knowing when someone is trying to reach me." "You read my lips from clear across the yard," Ida said, marveling. "I have had a great deal of practice," he said, and something in his eyes, some small light of amusement or pleasure she could not quite name, made her flush and look away toward the mended hinges lying upon his workbench. It was a small thing, that moment, the turning of a man's head at the shape of his own name spoken by a woman he had met only a handful of times, and yet it planted itself in Ida's memory like a seed that would not stop growing. She found herself thinking of it that night as she lay in her narrow bed in the unfinished ranch house, listening to the wind worry at the loose shingles her father had never gotten around to nailing down, and she found herself thinking of it again the next morning, and the morning after that, until she was forced to admit to herself, with some exasperation, that she was thinking of Peter Prescott a great deal more than any sensible newly arrived rancher's daughter ought to be thinking of the town blacksmith. Cedar Hollow in those years was not a large town, and gossip traveled its dusty street faster than any horse could carry it. It did not take long for word to spread that the new Whitfield woman was making frequent trips to the smithy, and it did not take much longer for that word to reach the ears of a man named Silas Grady, who owned the largest cattle operation in the valley and who had, in the weeks since her father's death, made no secret of his interest in the 400 acres of good creek-bottom grass that now belonged to Ida Whitfield alone. Silas Grady was not, on the surface, an unpleasant man. He was perhaps 40 years old, well-dressed for a rancher, with a neat mustache and a way of speaking that suggested education, though Ida had heard from more than one source that his fortune had been built as much on intimidation and quiet violence against smaller ranchers as on honest cattle dealing. He had called upon her twice already, ostensibly to offer condolences upon her father's passing, and each time the conversation had drifted, with what Ida felt was rehearsed casualness, toward the subject of her land, and how difficult it must be for a woman alone to manage such a property, and how much simpler her life might become were she to sell it to him at a fair price. Or, he had added on his second visit with a smile that did not reach his eyes, to consider some other arrangement between them that might see both their interests served. "I do not intend to sell my father's land, Mr. Grady," Ida had told him plainly on that second visit, standing on the half-finished porch with her arms crossed against the evening chill, "and I do not intend to marry for convenience, either mine or yours." "A woman alone out here is a hard thing to be, Miss Whitfield," Grady had said, mounting his horse with the easy grace of a man who had never once doubted his own charm. "The land is harder still. Fences fall. Cattle wander. Accidents happen to those who have no one to look after them. I would hate to see harm come to a young woman with such fine prospects, simply for want of a protector." She had not liked the shape of those words, protector spoken with such weight, accidents spoken with such careful lightness, but she had said nothing more, only watched him ride away down the lane with a growing unease she could not quite name, and it was that unease, more than anything else, that sent her back to the smithy again within days, though she told herself it was only the matter of a broken latch on the spring-house door. Peter noticed something was troubling her almost as soon as she stepped into the yard, before she had said a single word. He set down the horseshoe he had been shaping and crossed to meet her, positioning himself as he always did, so the afternoon light fell full upon his face and hers. "You look as though you are carrying a weight," he said. "What has happened?" She had not meant to tell him. She had meant only to ask about the latch, to keep their acquaintance within the tidy boundaries of customer and tradesman, but something about the plain directness of his question, the way he waited without impatience for her answer, undid the careful composure she had been holding since Grady's visit, and she found herself telling him everything: the 2 visits, the veiled threats, the unease that sat in her stomach like a stone. Peter listened with his eyes fixed upon her face the entire time, and when she had finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as though he were turning something over in his mind that did not sit easily there. "Silas Grady has done this before," he said finally. "Not to me directly, but I have watched him do it to others. The Hendricks family 2 years back before you came. Their well went bad, their fences were cut, and their cattle wandered onto Grady land where his men shot them for trespassing, all within a single season. They sold out cheap within the year and moved on to Nebraska. I do not say this to frighten you. I say it because you should know what manner of man you are dealing with, and because I do not think you should face it alone." "What would you have me do?" Ida asked. "I cannot hire a small army to guard 400 acres, Mr. Prescott. I have barely enough money to see me through the winter as it is." "You need not hire anyone," Peter said. "I will come myself, when I am able, between customers. I can mend your fences and look over your stock, and it will cost you nothing beyond the price of the iron, for I have little enough to do most evenings besides eat my supper alone and listen to the crickets I cannot hear." Ida laughed despite herself, a small surprised sound, and Peter's mouth curved into the beginning of a smile, the first she had seen from him that reached all the way to his eyes. "You joke about your own deafness," she said. "It is easier to laugh at a thing than to let it grieve you every day of your life," he said. "I have had 18 years to practice the laughing. Some days it comes easier than others." It was the beginning, though neither of them called it that at the time, of an arrangement that brought Peter Prescott out to the Whitfield ranch 2 or 3 evenings each week through that spring and into the summer, mending fences, checking on cattle, teaching Ida the particular knots and repairs a ranch demanded that her father had never gotten around to showing her before his death. She, in turn, began to learn the shape of his world, not out of obligation, but out of a growing fascination that she was slow to name as anything more than friendship, though it had long since become more than that in the quiet corners of her heart. She learned, for instance, that Peter could feel the approach of a rider or a wagon through vibrations in the ground long before he could see them, that he had trained himself over years to watch the behavior of animals for warning of things his ears could not catch, that he had a small collection of hand signs he had invented with his mother before her death, signs for water, for danger, for wait, for come here, that he taught to Ida one evening on the porch with a patience that made her chest ache with something she did not yet understand. "Show me again," she said, holding up her own hand to mirror the sign he had made, a flat palm drawn across the chest for danger. "Like this," Peter said, guiding her fingers gently with his own, his touch light and careful, as though she were something that might startle and run if he moved too quickly. "You will not need it, I hope, but if ever you cannot call to me, if ever your voice cannot reach me, you will have another way." "Why would I need to reach you in a way that is not calling?" Ida asked, though even as she said it, some part of her already knew the answer, knew that a man who could not hear a gunshot or a shout of warning behind him was a man who needed, more than most, someone willing to learn a language built not of sound, but of sight and touch and patient attention. "Because the world is full of things that make noise before they make trouble," Peter said quietly. "A rattlesnake in the grass, a rider approaching from behind, a fire catching in dry timber. I have lived my whole adult life listening with my eyes instead of my ears, and I have grown skilled at it, but I am not perfect, Miss Whitfield. There are moments when I cannot see what is coming, and in those moments, if you were near, I would want you to have some way of telling me." She did not tell him that evening how deeply his words had settled into her, how the image of herself standing beside him in some future danger, signing danger or wait or come here with her own 2 hands, had lodged itself in her mind as something she wanted rather than merely something practical. She only nodded, and practiced the signs again, until the light failed and Peter said he ought to be getting back before full dark, since even a man who read the ground could not read it in pitch blackness. The summer wore on, and Cedar Hollow noticed. It could hardly have failed to notice, for a town of some 300 souls has little else to occupy its evenings besides the comings and goings of its neighbors, and the sight of the town blacksmith riding out toward the Whitfield place 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes staying for supper, became a favorite subject of conversation at the mercantile counter and the church social alike. Not all of that talk was kind. There were those in town, and Ida heard of them soon enough through the well-meaning but indiscreet reporting of Mrs. Alma Foss, who ran the boarding house and considered herself the keeper of the town's moral temperature, who thought it unseemly for a young, unmarried woman to be spending so much time in the company of a deaf man, not because deafness itself was a moral failing, Mrs. Foss was quick to clarify, but because people did talk, and a woman's reputation was a fragile thing in a territory where marriageable men were scarce and marriageable women scarcer still. And surely Miss Whitfield could do better for herself than a blacksmith who could not even hear his own hammer strike the anvil. Ida had never in her life felt so immediate and so fierce a desire to defend another person as she did the evening Mrs. Foss said those words to her over tea, and she surprised herself with the sharpness of her own reply. Mr. Prescott has shown me more kindness and more honest help since I arrived in this territory than any other soul in Cedar Hollow, yourself included, Mrs. Foss, she said, setting down her cup with perhaps more force than the china strictly required. I do not care what he cannot hear. I care what he does with his 2 hands and his good heart, and I have seen little enough of either quality elsewhere in this town to go wasting my regard on gossip. Mrs. Foss had colored deeply and changed the subject, and Ida had ridden home that evening in a temper that did not fully cool until she reached the ranch and found Peter there already, mending a section of fence in the last of the daylight, whistling, she realized with a start, a tune she could not hear but could see in the shape of his lips and the tap of his boot against the fence rail, keeping time to some rhythm that lived only in his memory of music heard long ago, before the fever took it from him. "You are angry," he said, reading it plainly in her face as she approached. "Not at you," she said, and told him what Mrs. Foss had said, expecting perhaps that he would be wounded by it, or ashamed, but instead he only laughed, a real laugh this time, low and warm. "Alma Foss has been finding fault with me since I was 10 years old and too deaf to fetch her groceries properly the first week after my fever," he said. "I stopped minding her opinion of me around the time I turned 16. You should not let it trouble you either." "It troubles me because it is unjust," Ida said. "You are twice the man of anyone else in this town, and they judge you only for the one thing you cannot help and never chose." Something shifted in Peter's face at that, some careful wall coming down that she had not fully realized was there until she saw it fall, and for a long moment he only looked at her, the fence rail forgotten in his hands, until finally he set it down and stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes catching the last of the sunset. "No one has ever said such a thing to me before," he said, his voice rougher than usual, and Ida understood, with a rush of tenderness that nearly took her breath, that this man who had spent 18 years learning to read a world that so often forgot to look at him, had never once been told plainly that he was seen and valued and thought worthy. "Then I shall say it as often as it needs saying," Ida said, "until you believe it." He did not kiss her that evening, though she thought for one suspended heartbeat that he might, and she thought too that she would not have minded if he had. Instead he only reached out and took her hand in both of his, work-roughened and warm, and held it for a long moment as though it were something precious he had not expected to be given, before releasing her and returning, with visible effort, to the fence rail. And Ida rode home that night with her heart beating in a rhythm she had never felt before, and slept badly, and did not mind it in the least. The trouble with Silas Grady, however, had not gone away merely because Ida's heart had found other matters to occupy it. Through that summer, small misfortunes began to accumulate on the Whitfield ranch in a pattern too regular to be entirely coincidence. A section of fence would be found down, not fallen but cut clean through with wire cutters. A gate would be left open in the night, and cattle would wander toward Grady's land, where twice already Ida had been forced to ride over herself and argue with Grady's foreman, a hard-faced man named Ezra Voss, for the return of strays that Voss claimed had trespassed and might rightly have been shot. Peter mended each cut fence without complaint, and twice he sat up through the night in Ida's barn with a rifle across his knees, watching the yard by lantern light for any sign of intruders, though he confessed to her that a rifle was of limited use to a man who could not hear an approach and could rely only on his eyes and the vibrations of footsteps through the barn floor. "Then you should not be the one sitting watch," Ida said, worried, when she found him there one morning, bleary-eyed but unharmed. "It is too dangerous for you, Peter, more dangerous for you than for another man. It is dangerous for you regardless of who sits watch," he said. "I would rather be here and imperfect than safe at home and useless to you." It was the first time either of them had used the other's given name, and Ida noticed it land in the air between them like a small bell struck, and she saw in Peter's face that he had noticed it too, though he did not comment on it, only gathered his rifle and his hat and prepared to ride back to town for the day's work, pausing at the door to look back at her with an expression she could not quite read, something between hope and hesitation. "Ida," he said, testing the shape of her name in his own mouth, and she felt the sound of it, though he could not hear it himself, settle warmly into her chest. "I will come again this evening, if you will have me." "I will always have you, Peter," she said, and meant it more deeply than she had intended to reveal, and watched the color rise in his face before he turned and mounted his horse and rode away down the lane toward town. It was late in July when matters came finally to a head, on an evening that had begun ordinarily enough with Peter arriving to help Ida repair the roof of the spring house, a task that required them both to climb up onto the low sod structure with hammers and nails, while the sun sank slow and orange behind the western ridges. They had fallen into an easy companionship by then, trading small talk and comfortable silences, and Ida had grown so accustomed to watching Peter's face for his words that she scarcely thought of his deafness as an obstacle any longer, only as one more fact about him, like the color of his eyes or the calluses on his palms, simply a part of the whole of who he was. It was Ida who first saw the riders, 3 of them, coming up the lane from the direction of Grady's ranch at a pace too quick for a friendly visit, and she felt her stomach drop even before she could make out their faces well enough to recognize Ezra Voss riding in the lead, flanked by 2 men she did not know, all 3 of them armed. "Peter," she said, and when he did not turn quickly enough, absorbed in hammering a nail into the sod roof, she reached out and gripped his arm hard and made the sign he had taught her weeks before, the flat hand drawn across her chest, danger, and pointed down the lane. He turned at once, following her pointing finger, and his whole body went still and alert in an instant, the hammer forgotten in his hand. "Get down from the roof," he said, low and urgent, though of course he could not hear his own urgency, "and go into the house, bar the door." "I will not leave you out here alone," Ida said. "Ida, please, no," she said, and there was no argument in her voice, only a fierce and settled certainty. "We face this together or not at all." There was no time to argue further, for the riders had already reached the yard, and Ezra Voss was calling out something Ida could not quite hear over the pounding of her own heart, though she caught the words strays and trespass and pay what you owe or clear off the land, and she saw with a fresh spike of fear that one of the men behind Voss was already reaching for the rope coiled at his saddle horn. Not, she understood with sick relief, a rope meant for a hanging, but one meant perhaps for the springhouse door. To drag it loose, or for some other petty destruction meant to frighten rather than to kill. Peter climbed down from the roof and stood in front of Ida, positioning his body between her and the riders with a calm deliberateness that made her chest ache even in the midst of her fear. And when Voss began speaking again, Peter watched his mouth with the same careful attention he gave to any speaker. And when Voss finished, Peter answered in a voice pitched loud and clear, the voice of a man determined to be understood. "You are trespassing on Miss Whitfield's land," Peter said. "I would ask you to leave and to tell Mr. Grady that his business here is finished. This ranch is not for sale, and it will not be frightened into being sold." Voss laughed, an ugly sound, and said something to his companions that made them laugh too, and Ida saw one of them start to swing down from his horse, moving toward the spring house with clear intent to do some damage there. And it was in that moment, with Peter's back partially turned toward the dismounting man, and his attention still fixed on Voss's moving lips, that Ida understood the true danger of her beloved's deafness in a way she never fully had before. He could not hear the creak of leather as the man dismounted behind him. He could not hear the click of a pistol being drawn if it came to that. He was, in this moment, only as safe as her own eyes could make him. "Peter!" she shouted, though she knew already it might not reach him fast enough, and in the same breath she flung herself forward and grabbed his sleeve, yanking him half a step sideways just as the dismounted man swung a length of rope toward the springhouse door, and the sudden movement was enough to draw Peter's eye, and he turned in time to see the danger and step fully into it, catching the man's wrist before the rope could do its damage, wrenching it aside with the same strength that let him bend iron all day at the forge. What followed was brief and less violent than it might have been, for the man Peter had disarmed was not eager to test his strength further against a blacksmith's grip, and Voss, seeing the confrontation was going nowhere in their favor, called his men off with a sharp word and a warning that this was not finished, that Grady would have his land one way or another, before wheeling his horse and riding back down the lane with his companions trailing after him, leaving Ida and Peter standing in the yard with their hearts pounding, and the summer dusk settling gold and quiet around them as though nothing at all had happened. "You could have been killed," Ida said, her voice shaking now that the danger had passed, "and you would not even have heard it coming." "I heard it in your face," Peter said, "and in your hand on my sleeve. That was enough." He was trembling too, she realized, though he tried to hide it, and when she reached up without thinking and pressed her palm to his cheek, he leaned into the touch with a small, unguarded sound that might have been relief or might have been something closer to longing. And when he lowered his head at last to kiss her, slowly, carefully, as though asking permission with every inch of the distance he closed, she answered him not with words, which he could not have heard in any case, but with her hands rising to grip the front of his shirt and pull him closer, and the kiss that followed was long and warm and tasted faintly of the iron dust that never quite left his skin, and it settled. Something between them that neither of them would ever again seriously doubt. "I love you," Ida said, when at last they drew apart, and she said it slowly, deliberately, making certain the shape of the words was clear upon her lips for him to read even in the dimming light. "I have loved you, I think, since the first evening you turned around before I finished calling your name." "I have loved you since before that," Peter admitted, his thumb brushing gently along her jaw. "Since the day you sat on that crate in my yard and did not once look at me as though I were less than whole. I told myself I would not let myself hope for such a thing, a woman like you, but I have failed entirely at that particular discipline." They stood together in the yard a long while after that, until the stars came out fully overhead, and the crickets Peter could not hear filled the darkness with their song, and when at last he rode back toward town, he did so with a lightness in his chest he had not known in 18 years of silence, and Ida returned to her half-finished house and lay awake long into the night, smiling at the ceiling, thinking of the taste of iron dust and the warmth of a man's mouth against her own. But Silas Grady, as Peter had warned her weeks before, was not a man to abandon his ambitions merely because his hired men had been sent packing from her yard, and within days the town of Cedar Hollow was buzzing with a new development in the affair. For Grady had gone before the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne with a claim, dubious but not without some legal weight, that the survey establishing the boundaries of Ida's father's property had been improperly filed years before, and that a strip of the best creek bottom grazing land, nearly 100 acres of it, in fact belonged rightfully to his own ranch and had merely been mistakenly included within the Whitfield deed. It was, Peter told her when the news reached them both, a common enough tactic among the larger ranchers of the territory, using the courts and the slow machinery of government surveys to accomplish what intimidation alone could not. And though the claim itself might well be false, contesting it would require money for lawyers and travel to Cheyenne that Ida did not readily have. And Grady, with his greater wealth and his connections among the territorial officials, held every advantage in such a fight. "He means to bleed you dry with delays and fees until you have no choice but to sell," Peter said, sitting across from her at the small table in her kitchen, the deed itself spread out between them alongside her father's old surveying notes. "It is a cruel strategy but an effective one, and I do not know how we are to counter it without money we do not have." "We," Ida repeated softly, and Peter looked up from the papers to meet her eyes. "I meant it," he said. "This is not only your fight, Ida, if you will let me stand beside you in it." It was Ida's father's old surveying notes, in the end, that offered their first real hope, for tucked among the yellowed pages was a rough sketch, made in her father's own careful hand, showing the original boundary markers he had walked and measured himself upon first settling the land, markers that predated the official territorial survey by nearly 2 years, and that, if they could be located and confirmed, would establish beyond dispute that the disputed 100 acres had always been intended and originally measured as part of the Whitfield property. "If we can find these markers," Peter said, tracing the sketch with one blunt finger, "and if we can get a surveyor from Cheyenne to confirm them against your father's notes, it may be enough to settle the matter without ever needing to fight Grady in a courtroom at all." They spent the better part of the next week searching the disputed 100 acres together, riding the boundary in the early mornings before Peter's work at the forge demanded his return to town, comparing the landscape against her father's rough sketches, until at last, in a stand of cottonwood trees along the creek, they found what they were looking for. A stone cairn, half tumbled and overgrown with grass, but unmistakably placed by human hands, and beside it, carved faintly into the bark of an old cottonwood that had grown thick and gnarled in the years since, the initials J.W. and a date that matched the earliest of her father's notes. Ida wept a little at the sight of it, her fingers tracing her father's initials in the bark, and Peter stood quietly beside her, not intruding on her grief but simply present, his hand resting light and steady upon her shoulder until she was ready to speak again. "He knew this land better than anyone," Ida said finally, wiping her eyes. "He would not want it taken from us by a man like Grady, not for anything." "Then we will not let it be taken," Peter said. Securing the services of a surveyor from Cheyenne proved to be its own small struggle. For the man, once he understood the nature of the dispute and the identity of the rancher on the opposing side, was reluctant to involve himself in a quarrel with someone as influential as Silas Grady, and it was only through the intervention of the town's aging but well-respected doctor, a man named Elias Cobb, who had known Ida's father for years, and who bore Grady no particular fondness after having treated more than one of his intimidated tenant families for injuries sustained in disputes not unlike this one, that a surveyor was finally persuaded to make the journey to Cedar Hollow and confirm the boundary markers against the official record. The confirmation, once made, was unambiguous, and word of it reached Grady within days, carried, Ida suspected, by the very land office clerks he had hoped to use against her. He did not come himself to acknowledge his defeat. Instead, he sent Ezra Voss with a curt note stating that the matter of the boundary would not be pursued further, And though the note contained no apology, and though Grady's cold civility toward Ida whenever their paths crossed in town thereafter never fully thawed, the immediate danger to her land had passed, and with it, much of the fear that had shadowed her since her father's death. There remained, however, one final piece of unpleasantness that autumn, for Grady, stung by his defeat and perhaps wounded in his pride at having been outmaneuvered by a woman and a deaf blacksmith, he had never taken seriously as an adversary, took to speaking of Peter in town with a cruelty that reached Ida's ears within days, calling him a dumb brute unfit to meddle in the affairs of decent folk, suggesting to anyone who would listen that a woman like Ida Whitfield, young and not unattractive, and now possessed of a clear and unencumbered deed to good grazing land, could surely find a husband of greater standing than a man who could not even hear the wedding vows he might one day speak. It was at the Cedar Hollow Harvest Social, held that October in the church hall with fiddle music and tables groaning under the weight of pies and preserves brought by every woman in the district, that the matter finally came to open confrontation. And it was there, in front of nearly the whole town, that Ida Whitfield made plain, once and for all, precisely where her heart and her loyalty resided. Grady had come to the social, as he came to every public gathering, dressed finely and trailed by an air of self-satisfaction that had not been dented much by his failed land grab, and midway through the evening, emboldened perhaps by punch that had been given more than a little assistance from a flask, he had approached Ida where she stood near the refreshment table and made, in a voice pitched to carry, a remark about the poor quality of company she had been keeping of late. A remark that named Peter directly and unkindly and used, among other words, the term dummy, spoken with a curled lip that left no doubt of his intended cruelty. The hall went quiet in the way that public spaces do when something socially dangerous has just occurred, and Ida felt her face flush hot, not with shame but with a fury so complete it left her briefly unable to speak. And it was in that silence that Peter, who had been across the room speaking with Dr. Cobb, turned and caught sight of Grady's face, and though he could not hear a word that had been said, he read enough in the set of Grady's mouth and the sudden stillness of the room, and in Ida's stricken expression, to know that something had happened that concerned him directly. He crossed the hall without hurry, and the room parted for him as though sensing what was coming, and when he reached Ida's side, he did not raise his voice or his fists, only turned to face Grady directly, positioning himself so that his own face caught the lamplight fully, and spoke in the clear, deliberate voice of a man determined to be understood by every soul present. "I did not hear what you said, Mr. Grady," Peter said, "because I cannot hear anything at all, and have not been able to since I was 10 years old. But I can read well enough in your face, and in the faces of everyone watching us just now, that you have said something you believed would shame me, or shame Miss Whitfield for the company she keeps. I would ask you to say it again, slowly, so that I might understand it fully, and answer you as a man ought to answer another man who has insulted him in public." There was a long, taut silence, and Grady, caught between the desire to repeat his insult and the sudden awareness of just how many eyes in the hall were watching him, weighing him, waiting to see what manner of man he truly was, seemed to shrink somewhat under the collective attention, and he muttered something about having meant no particular offense, and turned to move away, but Ida was not finished. "You will not walk away so easily, Mr. Grady," she said, her voice ringing clear through the hall, all her fury finding its outlet at last. "You called Peter Prescott a dummy in front of this whole town, and I would have every soul here know that this man, who you would mock for what he cannot hear, has more honor and more courage in him than you have shown in all the years you have used your money and your hired men to bully smaller ranchers out of their land. He stood in my yard against 3 armed men when he could have stayed safe in town. He found the truth that saved my father's land when your lawyers tried to steal it with paperwork and lies. And he has never, not once in all the months I have known him, spoken a single cruel word about another living soul, deaf or hearing, rich or poor. I would rather spend my life with a man who cannot hear a word I say, but watches my face as though I were the only thing worth seeing in this world, than with a man who hears everything and understands nothing at all. The hall erupted, not into scandal but into something closer to applause, a low murmur of approval rippling through the gathered townsfolk, several of whom had their own quiet grievances against Grady's methods over the years, and had simply lacked the courage or the standing to voice them. And Grady, red-faced and thoroughly humiliated, made a hasty and graceless exit from the hall, and though he remained in the district for some years afterward, running his cattle and expanding his holdings as before, he never again troubled Ida Whitfield or spoke openly against Peter Prescott, having learned, at considerable public cost, the danger of underestimating either of them. Peter, for his part, stood beside Ida through the whole of her speech, reading her lips, with an expression that shifted from startled to disbelieving to something so tender and so full of naked emotion that several of the older women in the hall, Mrs. Foss included, found themselves dabbing quite unexpectedly at their eyes, and when Ida finished speaking and turned to him, uncertain suddenly of how her outburst might have struck him, he only shook his head slowly, as though words had briefly failed even a man so practiced at reading them, before he pulled her into his arms in front of the entire town and kissed her soundly. And the fiddler, catching the spirit of the moment, struck up a lively reel. And the harvest social that had nearly been ruined by cruelty was saved instead by love, and became, in years to come, the story most often told about how the deaf blacksmith and the rancher's daughter had come at last to be acknowledged as a pair by the whole of Cedar Hollow. They were married the following spring, in April of 1879, in the same small church hall where Ida had made her declaration, with Dr. Cobb standing as witness and Mrs. Foss, thoroughly reformed in her opinion of the match, organizing the wedding breakfast with as much enthusiasm as she had once devoted to gossiping about it. Ida wore her mother's wedding dress, brought all the way from Ohio in the same trunk that had carried her west, taken in at the waist by her own careful needle in the evenings leading up to the ceremony, and Peter wore a new suit purchased with money he had been quietly saving for months, though he confessed to Ida, laughing, on the morning of the wedding itself, that he had very nearly spent the money instead on a new set of anvil tongs before catching himself and remembering what mattered more. The ceremony itself was conducted with particular care, for the minister, a thoughtful young man newly arrived from the East named Reverend Josiah Bell, had taken the trouble in the weeks before to learn from Peter a handful of the signs he and Ida had developed together. And so, when the moment came for vows, Reverend Bell spoke the words aloud for the benefit of the gathered witnesses, while also making certain his own face was turned fully toward Peter, allowing him to read every word directly from the minister's lips. And when it came time for Peter to speak his own vows, he did so in that same careful, deliberate voice, looking not at the minister but at Ida, so that she alone might understand that every promise he made that day was made to her and for her, unheard by his own ears but felt, he said afterward, more deeply than any sound he could remember from before his illness. "I cannot hear the sound of your voice," Peter said as part of his vows, words he had practiced for days beforehand with the minister's patient help, "but I have learned every shape your mouth makes when you speak my name, and I will spend the whole of my life watching for it, and I will never look away, and I will never, so long as I live, look at another woman the way I look at you, for you are the only woman whose face I have ever needed to read to know the whole of my own heart." There was not a dry eye in the small church hall by the time he finished, and Ida, her own vows spoken through tears of happiness, thought that she had never in her life heard or seen anything so beautiful. Their life together, in the years that followed, was not without its hardships, for ranching in the Wyoming Territory remained a demanding and often unforgiving occupation, and there were hard winters when cattle were lost to blizzards, and dry summers when the creek ran low and the grass browned early, and more than one season when money was tight enough that Ida took in sewing work from town to help see them through. And Peter worked later into the evenings at the forge than his tired body strictly wished to allow. But they faced each hardship together, and Ida found, as the years passed, that she had grown so accustomed to communicating with Peter through the careful combination of clear speech, patient lip-reading, and the small vocabulary of signs they continued to expand together, that she sometimes forgot entirely, for whole conversations at a stretch, that theirs was a marriage built around an absence most people would have considered a great misfortune. It was, in fact, precisely that absence that made certain moments of their marriage particularly sweet, for Peter's attentiveness, born of necessity, never dulled into the comfortable inattention that so often crept into long marriages elsewhere. He watched Ida's face at the supper table every evening not merely to understand her words, but because he had trained himself, over a lifetime, to find meaning and comfort in the act of watching. And Ida came to treasure the particular quality of his gaze, steady and complete, in a way she suspected few other wives in the territory ever experienced from their husbands. Their first child, a son, was born in the winter of 1880, and they named him Josiah, after the young minister who had married them. And Ida watched with quiet joy as Peter learned, in those first months of fatherhood, to read his infant son's cries not through sound, but through the shape of his small open mouth and the color rising in his tiny face, holding him against his own chest at night so that he might feel, through vibration alone, whether the child's crying had settled into sleep. 2 years later came a daughter, whom they named Sarah after Peter's late mother, the woman who had first taught him to read lips and to make signs with his hands, and Ida made certain in the years that followed that both children learned their father's signs alongside their spoken words, so that the whole household spoke, in a sense, 2 languages at once, one of sound and one of sight, woven together so thoroughly that neither child ever thought to question why their father sometimes answered a question before it was fully asked aloud, watching instead for the shape of the coming words upon their mother's or their own lips. There was a moment, when Josiah was perhaps 4 years old, that Ida would treasure for the rest of her life, when the boy came running into the smithy yard calling for his father in the exact way Ida herself had once done, shouting Papa across the open space without yet understanding that shouting alone would never be enough. And Peter, absorbed at the forge with his back to the yard, turned before the boy had finished the second syllable, exactly as he had turned for Ida so many years before, and swept his son up into his arms with a delighted laugh. And Ida, watching from the gate, felt her heart swell with a happiness so complete it nearly ached, understanding in that moment that, whatever the world had taken from Peter Prescott when the fever stole his hearing, it had given him something rare and precious in return, a way of loving that missed nothing, that watched always, that never once took for granted the presence of the people he cherished. Cedar Hollow itself grew and changed around them through those years, as towns across the Wyoming Territory did in that era, with the arrival of the railroad spur in 1885 bringing new settlers and new commerce. And Peter's smithy, once a modest operation serving a scattering of ranches, grew busy enough that he eventually took on an apprentice, a young man named Thomas who had lost the use of one arm in a mining accident, and who, like Peter, had found in Cedar Hollow's blacksmith shop a place where his particular limitation mattered less than his willingness to work hard and learn well, a small legacy of tolerance that Peter, without ever quite intending to become anyone's example, had helped to establish in the town simply by proving, year after year, patient and skilled and beloved by his neighbors, that a man's worth was never rightly measured by what he lacked. Silas Grady, for his part, sold his ranch and left the territory in 1888, following a series of poor cattle seasons, and some said, a general souring of his reputation in the district that had begun, more than a few old-timers claimed, with the night at the harvest social when a rancher's daughter had stood up to him in front of the whole town on behalf of a deaf blacksmith, and had not backed down, and had, in the years since, been proven right about the character of both men in every particular that mattered. Ida's father's land prospered under their joint stewardship, the creek bottom acres that Grady had once tried to steal becoming some of the finest grazing pasture in the whole valley, and Ida often walked the boundary in the early mornings with her children trailing behind her, showing them the old cottonwood tree where their grandfather's initials were still faintly visible in the bark, telling them the story of how their father and mother had found it together and saved the family's future in doing so. It was on one such morning, many years after their wedding, with Josiah nearly grown and helping his father at the forge most afternoons, and Sarah, now a bright and curious girl of 12, showing an unexpected talent for the same careful attentiveness that had always marked her father's manner, that Ida found herself standing beside Peter at the edge of the creek where they had first discovered the boundary marker, watching the water run clear and cold over smooth stones. And she reached for his hand as she had done so many times over the years, and he turned to look at her, as he always did, ready to read whatever words she might have for him. "Do you remember," she asked, making certain her face caught the morning light so he might read her easily, "the first day I came to your smithy and called your name 3 times before I understood you could not hear me?" "I remember," Peter said. "I remember thinking you looked as though you might cry from frustration, standing there in my yard shouting at a man who would not turn around." "I very nearly did," Ida admitted, laughing. "And then you turned, and I understood everything had changed, though I did not yet know it would change quite this much. I turned because some part of me already knew, before I understood it myself, that you were someone I did not want to miss," Peter said. "I have spent my whole life training myself to notice what others overlook, Ida. I noticed you the moment you crossed my yard, and I have never once, in all the years since, regretted a single moment I spent learning to read your face instead of merely hearing your voice, for I do not think any voice, however sweet, could have told me half so much about you as your eyes and your mouth, and the whole of your expression have told me every single day we have been together." "You never did look at another woman again," Ida said softly, remembering the words of his wedding vow, the promise he had made before the whole of Cedar Hollow and kept faithfully every day since. "I never needed to," Peter said, drawing her close against him, the creek murmuring beside them in a sound he would never hear but that Ida, resting her head against his chest, could feel echoed in the steady, contented beat of his heart. "You were, from the very first afternoon, the only face I ever wanted to watch for the rest of my life, and I have found, in all the years since, that watching you has taught me more about love, and about being truly seen and truly seeing another person in return, than any amount of hearing ever could have done." They stood together a long while by the creek that morning, 2 people who had built a marriage not upon the easy foundation of shared sound, but upon the harder, deeper foundation of shared attention, of patience learned and practiced daily, of a willingness to meet each other fully in whatever language the moment required, spoken or signed, sound or sight. And when at last they turned to walk back toward the house where their children waited and the smithy fire burned steady in its forge, Ida thought, as she often did in quiet moments like this one, that she had come west as a grieving daughter with nothing but a deed and a trunk of clothes to her name, and had found instead, in a deaf blacksmith who read her lips across a dusty yard on an ordinary spring morning, the truest and most enduring love of her entire life, a love that had weathered a scheming rancher's greed and the casual cruelty of small-minded gossip, that had grown strong through shared hardship and shared triumph alike, and that showed, in the steady warmth of Peter's hand around hers as they walked, no sign whatsoever of ever growing dim. Cedar Hollow continued to grow through the years that followed, and the story of the deaf blacksmith and the rancher's daughter became, in time, one of the small legends the town told newcomers, alongside the tale of the original survey and the cottonwood tree with its faded initials. A story told not with pity for what Peter Prescott could not hear, but with genuine admiration for what he had built despite it, and for the woman who had seen him clearly from the very first afternoon she crossed his yard, when no one else in 3 counties had thought to look at him twice. Josiah Prescott grew to take over his father's smithy in time, learning the trade at Peter's side just as Peter had learned it from his own father before the fever came. And Sarah Prescott, in a turn that surprised no one who knew the family well, went on to teach at the small schoolhouse that opened in Cedar Hollow in the following decade, where she made a point, throughout her long career, of ensuring that any child who came to her lessons with some difficulty of body or mind, whether of hearing or sight or any other limitation the harsh territory sometimes dealt to its youngest and most vulnerable residents, was never once made to feel less capable or less worthy of a good education than any other child in her care, a legacy of compassion she credited always when asked, to the example set by her own father and mother. And Peter and Ida Prescott, growing old together in the house on the ranch that had once nearly been stolen from them, continued for the whole of their long lives to greet each new day much as they had greeted every day since that first spring morning in 1878, with Peter turning, unfailingly, the instant Ida's mouth began to shape his name, whether she called to him across a crowded room or a quiet kitchen or the wide, sunlit yard of the smithy where he had first taught her that love, at its truest, has never required the sound of a voice so much as it has required the willingness of one heart to be fully, patiently, faithfully seen by another, for as long as both of them should live.